All right. So today we're going to talk about rationality and spirituality. And this is a dilemma. As we know, it's perplexed people for over 2,500 years when they began writing about it, in early Western civilization. And rationality in spirituality. And this is about blending the sacred and the secular, the finite and the infinite. And so, this is a really exciting topic. I'm really excited to talk about it with Eric Bess. And, he's a practicing representational artist. He's currently a doctoral student at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. And he also writes on art, culture, and philosophy. So Eric Bess, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And so this topic, rationality and spirituality, is near and dear to my heart. And as I said, this has perplexed people for thousands of years. It's really hard to pinpoint. So you're going to do that for us. Sorry. So to start out, from the point of view of reason, when we look at things reasonably or rationally, faith can seem absurd. So how would you understand this?
So let me frame the discussion with a philosopher, and then we can talk a little bit about this philosopher, and then from his ideas, maybe extract some type of understanding. And when we're talking about faith up against rationality, for lack of a better way of putting it, a good philosopher to talk about is Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard is considered the father of existentialism. He's writing in the 1800s, and he's responding to a rationalism. So he's responding to the Enlightenment period, or the height of the Enlightenment period. And what he believes that the Enlightenment thinkers have done is sort of removed religion from the discussion, at least in a spiritual sense. He's mostly responding to another philosopher named Hegel. Hegel suggests that he creates a whole system of logic, just pure rationality. And he says that if you understand this system, practice it completely, that you will know the mind of God. And he says that this is the end of history. There's nothing else to know. We have finally done it, everyone. We have come to know the mind of God. And if you can make yourself purely logical, purely, absolutely logical, you too can know the mind of God. And Kierkegaard comes along and sort of says, well, this doesn't really seem to be true, because what that does is it removes us from how we exist on a day-to-day basis. Like logic itself doesn't necessarily happen in our day-to-day occurrences, at least not in an absolute way. But we live day to day. And Kierkegaard suggests that this living that we do, we're living in such a way, especially if you're talking about in a relationship with God, in a way that's absurd. It's not logical. It's not rational. It's an absurd relationship. This God who is infinite, eternal, all powerful, a mystery. We're unable to know this thing that we call God. Somehow, though, we, the finite, the powerless, the ephemeral, we can have a relationship with this thing. The thought itself is absurd. What's logical about it, says Kierkegaard. But yet that's a part of our existence. Not only that, but every day, if we're talking in relation to God, like Hegel was, we're making a decision where a single decision, day by day, determines how we may live for eternity. And that all has to do with existence. That's how we're existing. It has nothing to do with just the logic in our heads. It has everything to do with the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis. So, if we're acting in accordance with God's will, then we're guaranteed heaven, for instance. And if we're not, then we're guaranteed hell. And Kierkegaard says, even this is absurd, that one action can determine all of eternity for our souls. But it's not that, he doesn't mean absurd in a bad way, though. He means absurd in an interesting way. That this absurdity somehow is above what Hegel calls the logic, or the logical. And this is how he's trying to, in a way, combat absolute rationalism, absolute logic, what ends up becoming just absolute science and absolute scientific materialism. At least that's what it evolves into. Hegel, in his defense, is trying to say, well, this is how we know God, the absolute. He calls it the absolute mind. We know God through logic. Karl Marx ends up taking these ideas and says we remove God from the equation, and this is just how we know material stuff. And so that idea evolves into scientific materialism and Marxism. Kierkegaard hates this idea. And he thinks that what it does is it limits human beings' potential.
Okay, so it sounds like Kierkegaard, he's taking, he's really into understanding faith and what it's about, but that goes against what a lot of people think is reason, where Hegel is approaching it from, this logical standpoint, and they're both trying to converge. Are they both trying to converge in the same point, or do you think they're going off in two different directions?
I think they're going off in two different directions. I think Kierkegaard is trying to create a personal pathway to God. And in a way, he's saying that everyone's path is different. But the one thing that's common between all these paths is how absurd it is.
Sorry, when you say absurd, because I know during the Enlightenment was a reaction to religious fundamentalism that was, before that, the centuries before, where religion was controlled, or its narrative and way of spirituality was controlled by, the papacy institutions. Some people disagreed with that. Then there became, all these offshoots of Christianity to kind of counteract that. So do you think Kierkegaard was responding to that in this way as a reaction against it?
Partially. I think his main beef, though, was with these rationalists. But yes, I think you're right. He criticized the group a lot, him and other philosophers during this time. It became the hip thing to criticize large institutions. He suggested that he breaks the way we live up in society into really three different types of people. You have an aesthete or an aesthetician, someone who does everything for the sake of their own individuality. They live to sort of satisfy themselves, to create beautiful moments, and they believe that they can do all of this by way of their own will. And then there's the ethicists, who their only purpose is to carry out the standard of the group that they belong to. And he says that these are the two that are contrasting in society right now. And then there's a third, and the third one is the religious person who is bound by faith. So this ethicist is the person who's sort of a part of this institution. The church issues an order, and then the people just sort of follow the order. And then you have a big group. And in a way, Kierkegaard is like, this is the type of thing that brings about inquisitions. This is the type of thing that's dangerous, where you just have a big group of people following an ethics established by a big group of people. And none of them are ever questioning the ethics. They're only trying to fulfill it. And he says that there's a problem with the aesthete as well. Of course there is, someone who's only sort of reacting spontaneously to the moment in relation to their own subjectivity and how they feel at that moment can be a dangerous person, or at least a person that's not producing anything for the well-being of society, or as a productive member of society. But he's kind of like, well, what if we bridge these two? What if there's a way to unite these two so that they balance each other out? And faith, he says, is one of the things that does this, because the faithful person, he brings up Abraham, who, interestingly enough, he's referred to as the father of faith. He's one of the only people in Christianity who does not doubt God, doesn't question God. Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac after he's wandered in the desert aimlessly for years by God's will. Abraham never questions God. He just says, okay. God says, do this. Abraham says, okay. God says, do that. Abraham says, okay. God says, I'm going to give you a son. Abraham says, okay. Decades pass. There's no son. God says, keep on wandering. Abraham says, okay. Then finally, God gives Abraham a son. It's not a son with his wife, though. Abraham says, okay. Then God gives Abraham a son with his wife. Abraham says, okay. Then God says, you have to go kill that son. Abraham says, okay. Abraham says, okay to God. It just never seems to doubt. Everyone else in the Bible that I can think of doubts God at some point. Even Jesus says, God, why have you forsaken me? Job questions God. Everyone at some point questions God. They have a question, not Abraham. Abraham just says, okay. And Kierkegaard says, what is this thing called faith that can just make someone say, okay, in something that's invisible? He says it's fascinating that Abraham, in order to carry out the duty of sacrificing Isaac, has to keep it a secret from the group. So he can't be considered an ethical person. The group would frown upon Abraham's actions. And he says, imagine it. He says, imagine Abraham waking up and God's like, all right, Abraham, today's the day. It's time to take Isaac up to the mountain and sacrifice him. And Abraham says, okay. And he looks at his son and he grabs the knife. He grabs his son's hand, and he begins to walk out of the house. He looks at his wife and he says, I'll see you later. He walks through the town market and he waves at everyone. No one knows what he's about to do. Everyone believes that this son is going to be the future of Israel. So he can't tell them that he's going to go sacrifice him. He has to keep it a secret because he knows they will think that it's wrong. Kierkegaard says that faith has raised the individual, that is what would otherwise be an aesthete, an aesthetician, has raised the individual above ethics. It's an interesting thing to say. So now through Abraham's relationship with God, he has gone beyond an individual relationship with himself, which would be what the aesthete has. He's also gone beyond an individual's relationship with the group and the group standard. Instead, he has an absolute relation with God, and he just follows God. And this is a unification, according to Kierkegaard, of both the aesthetic and the ethical. Because in doing this, he takes Isaac up there, follows everything that God has told him to do. But in doing that, he understands the ethical and he still maintains his individuality. He understands the ethical because he never reveals the secret, which suggests that he understands the ethical.
Okay.
Right? If he didn't understand the ethical, he would say, "Hey, you guys, I'm going up to the mountain to sacrifice Isaac." But if he didn't understand it, and everybody'd be like, "Whoa, what are you doing? You can't do that." He'd be like, "Why not? God told me I can." But no, he understands. He understands the ethical. He understands. He's fulfilled it. And so he knows not to say anything. He knows the ethical by way of stepping away from it. Completely backs away from it, knows not to tell anyone anything so that he can follow the law of God. And Kierkegaard says what Hegel has done is created this ethicist type of absolute community where everyone can.
Let's go back. Let's go back to the Abraham story quick here. So, do you think this was a sleight of hand, though, in God's relation to Abraham, where he's telling him to, sacrifice his son? Do you think this was a way of him to understand what he was doing and to be more realized within that process? Because just to get to moral of the story, he didn't sacrifice his son. Could you explain just that end part there and your thoughts on it and how it relates to this?
Yes. So here's my understanding. So Abraham, he pulls out the knife and he's going to sacrifice his son, and God has an angel intervene and tells Abraham to not sacrifice his son. He has, in a way, passed the test. And so the question becomes, well, what is the test? What is the test? And a lot of people say, well, it's a test of faith. And God is testing Abraham's faith. How far will Abraham go to prove his love of God? I personally don't quite think that that's what's happening here. This is my personal argument. I think that what we're seeing in a sense is in a way a master-apprentice relationship. You have master, who's God, and you have the apprentice, who is Abraham. And what the master is trying to teach is a certain lesson. And so the question has to become, well, what is the lesson? To me, the lesson is one of selflessness. So Abraham, up until this point, like I said, has been given a promise. This promise is a promised land, the promised land of Israel. He will have a son, Isaac, who will be the father of this great nation. And Abraham trusts this and follows God's word. But then there becomes it reminds me of I've heard the stories of like the Buddhist monk who will put all of their desires into a flame and then extinguish the flame and sort of cut off all of their desires. I think it's kind of the same here, where all of Abraham's worldly desire has been placed into this one child. I've been studying art for a good 17 years, professionally, and I've put all of myself into it. And if tomorrow someone were to, I have all of my desires into it, all of my future is dependent upon it. If tomorrow I was asked to sacrifice it, oh my gosh, it would be a difficult thing. It would be a difficult thing because myself is tied into it. So in a way, I feel like what God is saying is that you've put all of your desire into this son of yours. Let's provide a test for you so that you can extinguish that desire and gain a certain type of emptiness that corresponds with selflessness. And I think that that's personally what the test is about. I think this is also has to do with paradox. the absurdity of paradox in order to gain a deeper relationship with God and a deeper relationship with himself, and is his own individuality in relation to God. Because Kierkegaard says repeatedly that faith is the paradox of the individual's absolute relationship with the absolute. And so this paradox here is that he has to sacrifice himself. He doesn't go there to sacrifice Isaac. He thinks he is, but that's not the lesson at hand. He actually goes there to sacrifice himself, and in giving up himself and all that God promises, he actually gains himself and all that God promises. And this is what Kierkegaard means by this just being absurd. There's nothing logical about this. There's nothing logical about it whatsoever. It laughs in the face of logic. It's absurd, but yet somehow it's how Abraham reached his full potential. Logic does not provide access to an individual's full potential, at least not logic alone, not logic in an absolute sense.
Okay, and then so when you're getting to Hegel and his logical approach, do you think then that the world, let's say from a purely rational standpoint, but if you try to understand the world from a purely rational standpoint, then Kierkegaard's absurd. We'll just take your Abraham Isaac story. They can never reach that point, right? So you're saying there's a limitation, and the limitation might be, we'll just say the infinite, because Kierkegaard does talk about the finite and the infinite and a blending of those two things. But you're saying maybe Hegel with his logic, do you think he can reach that point? Do you think like scientific rationalism that was coming about during Kierkegaard's time, and Hegel, how would Hegel understand Isaac and Abraham's story? Like how would he interpret that? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. I don't know how he would interpret that story. I do think that he maybe has even written on it, but I haven't read that. I do think though that he would think that he is reaching the infinite by way of logic. That logic is the infinite because logic doesn't exist here on earth. Not in an absolute sense. Of course, you can find it in places, but you have to rationalize in order to find it. It goes beyond worldly things. It exists only in our heads. And so for Hegel, the mind itself is the thing that accesses God. It's the mind. And by knowing how the mind works inside and out, logically, mathematically, one can get to know God, the infinite, and that this was accessible to everyone. So I do think that Hegel would say, well, my way works. My way works. Kierkegaard is talking about blending these two together, which is why Kierkegaard talks about a practice. He's talking about Abraham doing something, which is, again, a difference between this existentialist philosophy and this rationalist philosophy. Hegel's just talking about thinking. What's the point of doing something? The doing itself isn't going to get you closer to God. It's just the thinking that will. And Kierkegaard's like, well, no, not actually. The thinking at some point has to disappear because faith, what thinking is there in faith? Instead, what we have to have is a doing. And he felt that too many Christians had forgotten what it meant to be a Christian. They were too busy making judgments, which again is a very sort of scientific rationalist way of approaching things. And they were making absolute determinations, all in terms of in their heads, but none of them were actually practicing the laws of their religion. None of them were doing what was required of them. And Kierkegaard said, this is a problem. He's for him, it was a problem. Now, Hegel, I think Hegel was taking science and applying it to the mind later. And I mean, like very soon after him, it was taken away from the mind and away from God and just applied to the world. I don't think Hegel would have agreed with that necessarily.
Okay. Yeah. And just to kind of put this maybe in a little bit of context, during Kierkegaard and Hegel's time, there was kind of a switch, I think, at that point. Is from the sapient, or the wise way of understanding the world. How some people interpret it, just using faith and it's a different way of looking at the world, more towards the transcendental, and then after that, it was more towards the secular way of understanding the world. We went from natural law, which the ancient Greeks called telos, divine law, and how to understand it. All their wisdom is pulled from divinity. And then after that was scientific rationalism. So all meaning was pulled from, as you said, this determination, after Hegel, you said. And then we get scientific rationalism. With scientific rationalism, we're stuck in this mode of thinking purely logic based. And then natural law is pulled from the divine. So there was that separation there that happened during their time. So where is this Hegel? And then after that, you were talking about scientific rationalism. Where does that take the mind?
So from my understanding, the mind goes from Hegel correlates the mind with God. And then after that, in German philosophy, there are some of Hegel's contemporaries who disagree with him and challenge him. You have Kierkegaard, who we've been talking about, and there's another one named Schopenhauer, who is an atheist. He does not believe in God at all, and he believes that there's a rational way that we can approach the world and ethics in the same way that a philosopher he admired talked about these things, and that was Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant is probably one of the biggest people who made this separation, because he said that there are things and then there are things in themselves. So there are things and then there are essences to things. He says you can know a thing, you cannot know a thing's essence though. So, we can go out and study a tree, but we cannot know what a tree is in its absolute sense. There's no way we can define treeness. We can just study the tree. And he applies this to everything. So it's the same with a human being. I can study a human being, what they look like, how they function, but I can't know what the essence of a human being is. Just can't know it. So with Kant, you have this absolute rationalism that comes about because it becomes, how are we supposed to live in the world if that's the case? And Kant says, we all have this same rationality. And so we can rationalize our way to truths that exist for all of us. And he came up with this, it's called the categorical imperative, because he was very adamant about the importance of morals. And he said the categorical imperative was something along the lines of, don't follow a law that you wouldn't have be a law for everyone, which is just another variation of the golden rule. But Kant was a religious person, but he was trying to remove the divine from religion and see if there was a way, by virtue of our own minds, we could rationalize our existence. Schopenhauer takes that a step further and just removes God from the equation altogether. Nietzsche comes along and says, all of you guys have killed God, and that's unfortunate because God was a product of our imaginations, and God allowed us to produce the best version of ourselves. This is kind of similar to what Kierkegaard says, but Kierkegaard actually believes God is God, that it's not just a part of your imagination, that God exists and it's a real thing that pushes you to your limits. And Nietzsche says, we can make up gods that push push us to our limits, personal gods that can create for us what we are to become. But we don't need to believe in some God out there away from us. We can believe in things right here on earth, the material things right here on earth. And from this, fashion for ourselves a whole new reality that can bring us toward a brand new future. And then Marx comes along, and Nietzsche is really disgusted with Hegel and Marx. He doesn't like this sort of socialist and communist ideologies because Nietzsche believes that individuals have to find their path. They have to turn toward what's difficult in order to become their best self. They can't shy away from suffering. And then Marx comes along and he says, let's get rid of all of that stuff, all of the traditional stuff, all of the religion, all of the belief in, imaginative things and all of that. And let's just focus right here on what's happening right in front of us. The material world is the only thing that's real. It's the only thing that's real. So let's focus on it. Let's get rid of individuality altogether, because that's a product of your imagination, as is the idea that you own something. So let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of all of these things that would suggest that there's anything outside of the reality that you experience every single day. And that's kind of how all of that evolves from Kant, who's sort of like the father of, maybe not the father, but he's a big player in Enlightenment philosophy. From Kant all the way to Marx, with some of the big thinkers from that 150-year time period.
Okay. So I don't know if you want to go back to Kierkegaard, because with him, he was very focused on, on the one hand, he talks about winnowing down the thoughts. His big thing was not thinking about things so much. But there again, he puts a lot of emphasis on becoming your true self. What he would say is go beyond the mass man. So as you were talking earlier about people following institutions that were a part of Christianity and that he was maybe reacting against. So, in that sense, when we look at it, how would he, so say Kierkegaard was Abraham, how would he have handled that situation? What are your thoughts on that? Put Kierkegaard in Abraham's shoes. Just based on whatever, his thoughts were, just make scenario. How would he have approached that?
I don't think Kierkegaard could have done what Abraham did. And I think he says as much. He says that Abraham's someone I cannot understand. Of course, he says this in praise of Abraham, because he's trying to get beyond understanding, which is the only thing the rationalists are trying to do, is understand stuff. But I think also, in a way, I think that would have prevented him from being able to carry out the act. I think, though, that he may have said that wasn't a path for me in the first place, which is why it didn't happen to me. God's plan for me was something different. And so Kierkegaard, he was very devout in this and wanted, he practiced, he was one philosopher who practiced what he was writing about. And anytime he thought something was getting or competing with his love of God or his relationship with God, he would find a way to sacrifice it. So he was engaged at one point and he sacrificed it. And he just tried his best to live as religious a life as he could in society. So without being a monk or a priest or that type of person, he was trying to be a regular person who had a deep religious understanding of the world that he participated in. So yeah, as far as Abraham is concerned, I think that's what he would have said. I think he would have said, that's something that is outside of my domain. It's something I can't understand. It's not a test for me. It's not a test for me. And also, back to Abraham, I think that it's interesting that God has Abraham wander for decades. Why doesn't he just have this happen sooner? No, why doesn't he give Abraham his son 40 years earlier and then have Abraham try to sacrifice him? And again, I think this goes back to Kierkegaard's point that this, in a way, is a path. It's a path, and everything comes in its time. And so Abraham's test at that moment was his test at that moment. He had other tests before that, and all of those tests he had to pass. And only at the specific time, when his environment produced certain things, was he then tested in how he reacted to it.
Okay.
And I think Kierkegaard would say for each of us out here, this is the truth. We're all on this path. We have individual paths. It's not about, you doing what someone else wants you to do or what some church says is law. Deep down in your spirit, you have this connection with God, and God is guiding you on this path, and your path is going to be different from everyone else's. But if you listen to this thing in you, you'll be authentic on this path, and you'll constantly grow to ever new heights. Your potential will always, you'll always be tapping into it. You'll always be unleashing it in the eyes of God. Otherwise, you'll always be living according to the standard of someone else or some other group, or you'll live according to the limitations of your own will and your own strength, both of which will get you nowhere as far as your own full potential and authenticity are concerned.
If I were Abraham, I'd be like, what? No. I'd like, this is, what are you asking me to do? And I would question it. I honestly would. I'd be like, no, this is weird. Why are you doing this to me? I think, yeah, a lot of people would approach that scenario probably the same way, or they might have, just an infinite amount of understandings on it based upon their life experiences. Little nuances here and there. And so then we go back to, what is rational in the situation? For Abraham, it was a very rational thing to do. Whereas Kierkegaard would be like, it's cool what he did, but, it's not something that, yeah, great for him, but, not something I could do. And me, I'd be like, no, that's just weird. I don't know. So it's, everybody's going to approach this differently, and they're going to have a different understanding of reason in this sense. So how would, in terms of spirituality, faith, and things, there's a gray area in there. And then so in that gray area, a lot of different things can happen. So how do these people understand this? Because rationality can mean something different for everybody.
Yes. I think the philosophical definition of it is that it cannot. 1 + 1 = 2 for everyone. And that's just an absolute truth. And this was the point of Hegel's logic, is that these truths are absolute. They're just absolute. If A = B and B = C, then C = A. It's just logic. There's no way to step outside of it. It's absolute. And since it's absolute, and since it's also beyond the world, that it's just happening in our minds, it has to be connected to God somehow. It just has to be. How could it not? So I think that they are thinking, well, rationality, it is an absolute truth. And they're responding to that definition. So Kierkegaard is responding to that definition and saying, well, logic may be absolute in that way, but it does not embody the relationship to God, at least not the one we're told about. And if that's the case, then there has to be something else beyond it. That by beyond, he doesn't mean that it discards it. Like we talked earlier, Abraham still he's rational. He's not taking his son and like throwing him over his shoulder and hopping and skipping around town, like singing a song, I'm going to sacrifice my son. Like he's not being crazy about it. He's very calculated and thoughtful about it. He doesn't tell anyone. He hides it. This takes thought and deliberation. So, he's being rational about it, but he's being rational in relation to his relationship to the God that he worships. So as far as God is concerned, Abraham's being perfectly rational. According to the group, he's not being rational at all. And I think this is where the line becomes difficult, because even it seems anyways, according to Kierkegaard, your understanding of God can only be your understanding. It can only be your relationship. It's no one else's. It's a personal relationship. Even if you tried to explain it, this is one thing Kierkegaard says about Abraham. Even if he tried to explain it, no one would understand him. No one would understand. They'd all be left dumbfounded. He would just be left misunderstood. And it's the same for a lot of us. When we have a belief in something that other people may be like, that's a little weird. It becomes a relationship that we have with this thing that we consider is beyond us. And how we express that, we have to find a way, these, those people who are spiritual or religious, they have to find a way to make it rational so that people can understand it. And sometimes that happens successfully and sometimes it doesn't. But as far as the philosophical approach to rationality is concerned, it's not rational at all. It can only be rational in terms of the relationship between the follower or the devotee and the thing being worshipped, or the God being worshipped.
Okay, so yeah, well, let's end this by going into more of Kant's approach and diving more into scientific rationalism, because I think in their situation, Abraham would be just nonsensical, insane. And, there's maybe several reasons for that, in that he's trying to commit a crime. In one sense, he's trying to commit murder, and that's not rational. But scientific rationalism, if you follow it to its root, though, and say you take out God because God is not, a rational concept. We'll just say, we'll take it to the extreme, with Marx, and say, a lot of our modern society is kind of based on that train of thought now, where it's, at least in Western Europe and all that, in the United States, not as much, but it's where if you focus on the natural law of things, which our Constitution is based on, the Bill of Rights is actually based on the Ten Commandments. In Western Europe, though, it's more distilled down to secularism takes precedent. And so in that sense, when you look at it, the morality of it is, okay, so you're killing a person. I wouldn't want to be killed either. So that is wrong. And, with scientific rationalism, we're stuck in the human way of interpreting things, though. And so do you think there's a path to something in that sense? Like, what is the end goal? Because, to take natural law and Kierkegaard and Hegel, and their approach was to this divinity, to understand that. And so when we have scientific rationalism and we have logic distilled down into its I don't know if you want to say like absolute state, what's the end goal there? So we're just kind of taking things to extreme, an extreme here, with Abraham on one end, and then maybe we'll just say Marx on the other end.
So I think with Marx, the goal would be communist utopia brought about by bloody revolution. So I think that's the goal for him, and it's a material utopia. So it's a utopia in which everyone has all that they need, and everyone does essentially what they want. So there's an absolute freedom that's suggested in that, in terms of one's place in the world. Of course, though, that freedom comes with the abolishment of individuality, which of course is believed to be a mindset. So, it's almost as if individuality is a belief system. If we get rid of that belief system, then the individual will also cease to exist. Just like scientific rationalism can get rid of God. Like if you change the belief system and the people at large no longer believe in God, then God will just cease to exist. And this is why Nietzsche said, God is dead, and you Enlightenment thinkers killed him. So I think that's the the goal for Marx, as far as that type of extreme scientific rational materialism is concerned. Of course, how that always turns out is different than what's intended. Quite often, whenever it's been practiced, people end up having no material, no freedom, and a lot of people end up dying under regimes that try Marxist thoughts out at their extremes. And a lot of people after World War II criticized Kierkegaard for this as well. They said, herein lies the danger of not questioning the orders of something or someone. So how many people during the Nuremberg trials just said, I was following orders. I was just following orders. An order came from above and I just carried it out. And then the question becomes, well, if one of you just would have questioned, what you were doing or why you were doing it, maybe you could have caused a hiccup in what became a huge, civil rights abuse, to put it lightly. So I think that's, there are, people have brought up problems on both sides of this argument in terms of Kierkegaard and in terms of Marx. Of course, Kierkegaard says our purpose, our telos, is to have a personal relationship with God, to sort of become who we are in the eyes of God. And for Marx, it's to become an instrument for the well-being of all others, to paraphrase poorly.
Yeah, so this brings, back to that quote by Aristotle: every virtue is a mean between two extremes, each of which is a vice. So maybe there's something there, but, as I said, with Kierkegaard and Abraham, everybody has their own path and they have to search this out. So do you think, like, reason, rationality, it has to have whatever the foundation is going to determine everything else with that? So with rationality, just as some kind of definition, just to put our finger on it, do you think it's more about the end result or like a process, like rationality, like a motor way of thinking, or the emphasis on the outcome?
I think rationality is the emphasis on the outcome. So, 1 + 1 = 2. That's why it's rational, because of what it equals. And it's the same with, like, Kant, for instance. The reason that the categorical imperative is rational is because the outcome is the same for everyone. The outcome, I would only do this if it were a law for everyone. The outcome has to be the same for everyone. And this is a big difference between what I think, it's a difference between rational philosophy and existential philosophy. For Kierkegaard, it's more about the process. It's not about the outcome. The outcome is sort of out of your hands. Kierkegaard doesn't know, not Kierkegaard, but Abraham doesn't know that he's going to be stopped from sacrificing Isaac. It's about the process. He doesn't know when he's going to get his son. None of that even seems to really matter in his story. His story seems to be about something else, about this journey that he's taking, this endless wandering, all of these tests, these threats coming in from multiple sides, and his trusting something beyond himself. So his seems to be more about the process.
Okay. Great. Well, yeah, so there's just about an hour worth of thoughts on rationality and spirituality and the different ways we can look at this. Obviously, this is a topic that, as said before, perplexed people since people began putting their thoughts down, 2,500 years ago, at least in Western civilization. So this is something that's probably going to continue to keep us on our toes, always, in some sense, because we're finite beings. And we're also maybe infinite, depending on the side of the coin here, because there was that separation between natural law, divine law, and then scientific rationalism. Is it a personal journey? Is this a personal journey we're walking on to understand rationality? Maybe that's the case. So anyways, here's some thoughts. So thank you for joining us. And thank you, Eric Bess, for your wisdom. This is always just a real pleasure. I always just love hearing you talk about these things. So.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always a great time.
Awesome. Well, guys, Merry Christmas, wherever you may be or whatever you're doing. So see you again next time. Thanks and bye.